You want to know what really happened? Not the sanitized version everyone else got, but the real story? Fine. I'm Lydia. I'm 28, and yeah, I told my husband I wasn't in love with him anymore right after he bailed me out of $30,000 in debt. And honestly, I'm not even sorry about it. Look, everyone keeps acting like I'm this terrible person, but they have no idea what my life was actually like. Paul worked constantly, and I mean constantly, 3 different jobs just to keep us afloat while I stayed home with our 3 kids, 9, 6, and 3 years old. You try dealing with that chaos every single day while your husband gets to escape to the real world, where adults actually appreciate him. I never asked to be a stay-at-home mom. Well, okay, maybe I did initially, but that was before I realized what it actually meant. It meant being invisible. It meant having 0 adult conversation unless you count arguing with customer service about why our internet got shut off again. It meant watching Paul get praised at work while I wiped butts and refereed sibling fights with no recognition whatsoever. The neighbors used to tell me how lucky I was. "Oh, Lydia, Paul worked so hard for you guys. You're so blessed." Blessed. Right? Blessed to have my entire identity erased in favor of being someone's wife and someone else's mom. These women had no clue what they were talking about. Easy for them to say when their husbands actually came home before 8 p.m. and didn't fall asleep on the couch immediately after dinner. I started shopping online because honestly, what else was I supposed to do? It wasn't like I could go out and get a massage or hit happy hour with girlfriends. Those little packages arriving at our door were literally the only bright spots in my week. A new sweater here, some cute shoes there. Maybe something special for the house to make it feel less like a prison. Paul never noticed anyway. He was too busy being the martyr who worked multiple jobs. When I found this online forum for wives who felt underappreciated, it was like finding water in a desert. Finally, people who understood what I was going through. There was this one guy, Will, who just got it, you know? He actually listened when I talked about feeling trapped and invisible. He didn't immediately jump to solutions or tell me I should be grateful for what I had. Will was different from Paul in every way that mattered. Where Paul was always stressed about money and work, Will actually had time for real conversations, deep ones, about dreams and feelings and what we really wanted out of life. He made me remember that I used to be an interesting person before I became just mom and wife. I know what you're thinking, but it wasn't like that at first. We were just talking, venting about our situations. His marriage was dead too. His wife was cold and career-obsessed, never made time for emotional connection. We understood each other in ways our spouses never could. When Paul tried to talk to me, it was always about practical stuff. Bills, schedules, who was picking up which kid when. Never about how I was feeling or what I needed emotionally. The more I talked to Will, the more I realized how emotionally starved I'd been in my marriage. Paul provided financially, sure, but what about everything else? What about making me feel valued and heard and attractive? When was the last time he complimented me on anything that wasn't related to keeping the house running or managing the kids? Meanwhile, my shopping was getting a little out of hand, but honestly, I deserved those small luxuries. I was saving Paul money by not getting my hair done professionally or going out with friends. A few packages here and there seemed like a fair trade for basically running our entire household solo while he played the hero at his various jobs. I wasn't keeping track of exactly how much I was spending because, frankly, Paul never asked. He just assumed I was handling the household budget responsibly. If he cared that much about our finances, maybe he should have been more involved instead of just throwing money at me and expecting me to make it all work. Will and I started talking every day. Real conversations about life and dreams and feelings. He told me I was insightful and funny and deserved better than being taken for granted. When I described my daily routine to him, he was genuinely shocked that Paul didn't appreciate everything I did. "You're basically running a small business," he said. "Childcare, housekeeping, administrative assistant, personal shopper, tutor. If he paid someone else to do all that, it would cost more than he makes." That's when it really hit me how undervalued I was in my own marriage. Will help me see that I'd been settling for crumbs while Paul got all the glory of being the provider. Where was my recognition? Where was my appreciation for keeping our family functioning while he was out there getting pats on the back from bosses and coworkers? The conversations with Will became the best part of my day. He actually cared about my opinions on things that mattered. Politics, relationships, life goals. Paul only wanted to hear about whether the bills were paid and if the kids had done their homework. Will treated me like an actual person with thoughts and feelings worth exploring. I started looking forward to our conversations more than anything else in my day. Will would message me good morning before Paul even woke up, and we'd chat throughout the day whenever I had free moments between kid chaos. He sent me articles he thought I'd find interesting, remembered details from previous conversations, asked follow-up questions about things I'd mentioned days earlier. Basic courtesy that Paul had stopped extending years ago. Our talks moved from the forum to private messages, then to video calls when Paul was at work and the kids were occupied. I'll admit, I started putting more effort into my appearance on those days. It felt good to be seen as an attractive woman again, instead of just a mom in yoga pants covered in goldfish cracker crumbs. Will was going through similar issues in his marriage. His wife treated him like a roommate who split bills rather than a romantic partner. They hadn't been intimate in months, barely spoke beyond logistics, lived completely separate lives under the same roof. Sound familiar? At least I wasn't the only one feeling completely disconnected from my spouse. The shopping continued, because honestly, those little treats were the only things keeping me sane. A new candle to make the house smell less like chaos, some cute workout clothes to help me feel human again. Gifts for the kids, because seeing them happy was one of the few bright spots in my routine. Paul never questioned the packages, so I figured he was fine with it. Looking back, maybe I was spending more than I should have, but Paul never set clear boundaries about our budget. He just worked his multiple jobs and expected me to figure everything else out. If he wanted more input on household spending, he should have made time to actually discuss it, instead of leaving all the financial decisions to me while he focused on earning. Will and I started having longer video calls, sometimes for hours after the kids went to bed. We'd talk about everything: childhood memories, future dreams, what we wished our lives looked like. He was planning to leave his wife eventually, once he figured out the logistics. His situation sounded even worse than mine, honestly. At least Paul was a good father, even if he was a mediocre husband. These conversations with Will made me realize how emotionally neglected I'd been for years. When was the last time Paul asked me about my dreams, or what I wanted out of life, beyond managing his household and raising his children? Will actually saw me as an individual person, not just an extension of my family roles. I know some people might judge the emotional connection I was developing with Will, but honestly, Paul had checked out of our marriage years ago. He came home exhausted, ate dinner while scrolling his phone, helped get kids ready for bed, then crashed on the couch watching sports highlights. Where was the emotional intimacy there? Where was the partnership beyond splitting household duties? The debt was creeping higher, maybe around $15,000 at that point. But I wasn't panicking yet. Paul was bringing in decent money from his various jobs, and I was managing our household efficiently. A few extra expenses here and there weren't going to break us, especially when I was saving him money in other areas by handling everything domestic myself. Will helped me understand that I wasn't asking for too much by wanting emotional connection and appreciation in my marriage. His validation meant everything when I was feeling so invisible in my own home. He reminded me that I used to be an interesting person with opinions and goals before I got consumed by everyone else's needs. When Paul did try to engage with me, it was usually about practical matters or when he wanted physical intimacy without any emotional buildup, like, sorry, but I need more than, hey, want to fool around, after 3 weeks of barely talking beyond scheduling logistics. Will understood that emotional connection had to come before physical connection. Revolutionary concept, apparently. Our conversations became more personal as Will and I shared frustrations about feeling unappreciated and emotionally starved in our marriages. He made me feel heard and valued in ways Paul hadn't in years. Sometimes I wondered what would happen if Will and I had met before we got married to other people. We seemed so much more compatible in terms of emotional needs and communication styles. The kids started noticing that I was happier during the day, more patient and engaged with them. Probably because I finally had something to look forward to, instead of just grinding through endless household tasks with no recognition. Will's attention and validation were giving me energy I hadn't felt in years. Paul remained oblivious to my improved mood. Probably because he was always focused on work stress or his own exhaustion. Even when I tried to share funny stories from my day or interesting things I'd read online, he'd give distracted responses while checking emails or scrolling through work messages. Will never made me feel like I was interrupting something more important. The video calls with Will became daily occurrences. And I won't lie, I started dressing up for them. Not in a crazy way, just putting on actual clothes instead of staying in pajamas all day. Maybe doing my hair and makeup. It felt good to be seen as an attractive woman again, instead of just a household manager who happened to be female. Our conversations grew more intimate as we shared deeper frustrations about our marriages. Will told me his wife made him feel like a burden whenever he wanted to connect emotionally or physically. She was always too tired, too stressed, too focused on her career to make time for their relationship. At least Paul wanted physical intimacy, even if he wasn't great at the emotional buildup. I found myself sharing things with Will that I'd never told Paul. Dreams I'd given up, resentments I'd been carrying, fears about losing myself completely in motherhood and marriage. Will listened without judgment and validated my feelings in ways that made me feel understood for the first time in years. The spending was definitely getting out of hand by this point, probably around $25,000 in debt. But I was managing the minimum payments and Paul hadn't noticed any issues. I justified it as compensation for all the unpaid labor I was doing to keep our family functioning. If he paid someone else to provide childcare, housekeeping, meal planning, and administrative support, it would cost way more than my shopping habits. When Paul tried to discuss our budget, I'd deflect by talking about how stressed I was managing everything while he was always working. I'd point out all the money I was saving us by handling household tasks myself instead of hiring help. He'd usually drop the subject because he felt guilty about being away so much for work. Will encouraged me to prioritize my own happiness for once, instead of constantly sacrificing for everyone else's needs. He helped me see that I'd been giving and giving while getting very little emotional nourishment in return. Paul provided financially, sure, but what about everything else I needed as a human being? My resentment toward Paul grew as I compared our marriage to the emotional connection I had with Will. Why couldn't Paul be more emotionally available? Why didn't he ask deeper questions about my thoughts and feelings? Why was our entire relationship focused on logistics and duties instead of genuine intimacy and partnership? I started fantasizing about what life would be like with someone who actually prioritized emotional connection. Will talked about leaving his marriage once he figured out the logistics, and sometimes I wondered what would happen if we both got divorced around the same time. Would we end up together? The thought was both terrifying and exciting. The kids were actually happier when I was in a good mood for my conversations with Will, so in a way, my emotional affair was benefiting the whole family. When I felt valued and heard, I was a better mother and household manager. Paul should have been grateful that someone was finally giving me the emotional support he couldn't provide. Paul started noticing that I seemed different, happier, but also more distant from him specifically. When he tried to talk about it, I told him he was imagining things because he was always exhausted from work. How could he accurately assess my mood when he barely paid attention to me anyway? I began comparing everything Paul did to how Will treated me. Paul's communication style seemed so surface level and practical compared to Will's depth and emotional intelligence. Paul's idea of romance was grabbing takeout and watching Netflix together, while Will sent me thoughtful articles and asked meaningful questions about my perspectives on life. The debt hit $30,000, and I was running out of ways to juggle the payments. Credit cards were getting maxed out, and I was starting to panic about how to handle the situation. But I couldn't bring myself to stop shopping entirely. Those packages were still the only bright spots in my week besides talking to Will. I knew I'd have to tell Paul about the debt eventually, but I was dreading his reaction. He'd probably make it all about his stress and how hard he worked, rather than understanding the emotional factors that led to my spending. Will helped me prepare for that conversation by reminding me that I deserved compassion, not judgment, for struggling with the isolation of my situation. When I finally couldn't hide the debt anymore because cards were getting declined, I had to tell Paul. But I was strategic about it. I waited until he was in a good mood, made his favorite dinner, and presented it as something I'd been trying to handle alone to avoid burdening him. I explained how isolated and overwhelmed I'd been feeling as a stay-at-home mom, how the shopping had become a coping mechanism for dealing with the stress of managing everything while he was always working. I made sure to emphasize that I'd been trying to protect him from worrying about it, on top of everything else he was dealing with. Paul's reaction was, well, exactly what I expected. First shock, then stress about the money, then immediately jumping into fix-it mode instead of addressing the underlying emotional issues that led to the problem. He took out a loan to pay off the credit cards without even asking why I'd felt the need to spend that much in the first place. I should have felt grateful, but honestly, I felt resentful. The fact that he could just magically come up with $30,000 proved that our financial situation wasn't as tight as he'd always claimed. If he'd been more generous with household spending all along, maybe I wouldn't have felt so deprived that I needed to compensate with secret shopping. When Paul tried to discuss how we'd gotten to that point, I shut down. I wasn't interested in being lectured about budgeting when the real issue was my emotional neglect in this marriage. He was treating the symptom instead of the disease, typical of his practical approach to everything. I continued talking to Will throughout this whole drama because honestly, he was the only person who understood what I was really going through. When I told him how Paul had reacted to the debt revelation, Will validated my feelings about being made to feel like a burden instead of receiving compassion for struggling. Will helped me see that Paul's immediate focus on the financial logistics rather than my emotional state proved how disconnected he was from my actual needs. A truly supportive husband would have asked he could do to help me feel less isolated and overwhelmed, not just thrown money at the problem and expected it to disappear. The fact that Paul could easily handle $30,000 in debt made me realize how much he'd been holding back financially while I scraped by on household allowances. If he'd been more generous with discretionary spending all along, I wouldn't have felt so deprived that I needed to compensate secretly. I started feeling like Paul was treating me like a child who'd misbehaved with the credit cards, rather than a partner who'd been struggling emotionally. His solution was purely transactional. Pay off the debt and move on, without addressing any of the underlying relationship issues that contributed to the situation. Will pointed out that Paul's response showed he valued financial control more than understanding my emotional experience. Instead of creating a safe space to discuss why I'd felt compelled to spend that much, Paul made it about his stress and the inconvenience of having to take out a loan. I felt more distant from Paul than ever after the debt conversation. He'd proven that he could solve financial problems easily when motivated, but he couldn't be bothered to address the emotional neglect that had led to those problems in the first place. Will was right. Paul saw me as a household manager who'd malfunctioned, not a person who'd been struggling. The loan payments became another source of tension because Paul would make comments about needing to tighten our budget while I was thinking, where was this financial awareness when you were working 3 jobs instead of spending time with your family? His priorities had always been about external validation through work achievement, rather than emotional investment in our relationship. I began sleeping in the guest room, claiming I needed better sleep to handle the kids' schedules. Really, I couldn't stand being physically close to Paul when I felt so emotionally disconnected from him. Will understood my need for space while processing everything that had happened. Our conversations became my primary source of emotional support as I dealt with feeling misunderstood and judged by Paul's reaction to the debt situation. Will reminded me that anyone would struggle with isolation and lack of appreciation, that my response was understandable given the circumstances. I decided it was time to be honest with Paul about Will. Not because I felt guilty, but because I was tired of pretending our marriage was working when it clearly wasn't. I'd found someone who actually understood me and made me feel valued, and Paul deserved to know that I'd connected with someone else emotionally. I chose a moment when the kids were at school and Paul was home between jobs. I explained that I'd been talking to someone online who really understood what I was going through as an underappreciated wife and mother. I made it clear that this person provided emotional support Paul hadn't been capable of giving me. Paul's reaction was so dramatic. Like, I'd been honest with him about needing emotional connection that I wasn't getting in our marriage, and he acted like I'd committed some terrible betrayal. I tried to explain that Will and I had developed a friendship based on mutual understanding of marital struggles, but Paul was too upset to listen rationally. I told Paul I wasn't sure I was still in love with him. Not to be cruel, but because it was the truth. How could I be in love with someone who'd emotionally neglected me for years? Will had shown me what real emotional intimacy looked like, and I couldn't pretend to be satisfied with Paul's surface-level approach to our relationship anymore. Paul wanted to try marriage counseling, but honestly, what was the point? We'd grown into incompatible people who wanted different things for marriage. He was content with a practical partnership focused on raising kids and paying bills. I needed deeper emotional connection and intellectual stimulation that he'd never been able to provide. I refused couples therapy because I wasn't interested in being told to lower my expectations or accept less than I deserved. Will had proven that someone could value my thoughts and feelings, could engage with me as an interesting person rather than just a household manager. Why would I want to go backward from that realization? When Paul asked how we could move forward, I honestly didn't know. I wasn't going to fake feelings I didn't have anymore, just to maintain the status quo. If he wanted to stay married to someone who didn't love him romantically, that was his choice, but I wasn't going to lie about my emotional state. I moved into the guest room permanently and stopped participating in the pretense of a happy marriage. If Paul wanted to keep up appearances for the kids and neighbors, fine, but I wasn't going to pretend everything was okay between us when it clearly wasn't. Will supported my decision to be honest about my feelings rather than living a lie. He understood that staying in a loveless marriage would be unfair to both Paul and me. We both deserved to be with partners who could meet our emotional needs rather than settling for practical arrangements. Paul kept trying to engage me in conversations about our marriage, but I'd said everything that needed saying. I wasn't in love with him anymore. I'd found emotional connection elsewhere, and I couldn't go back to pretending that financial support was enough to sustain a romantic relationship. I started feeling like Paul was being selfish by trying to force reconciliation when I'd been clear about my feelings. If he truly cared about my happiness, he'd accept that we'd grown apart and stop trying to guilt me into staying in an unfulfilling marriage. The kids noticed the tension, obviously, but they were resilient. Plenty of their friends had divorced parents who were happier apart than their parents were together. Sometimes marriages just run their course, and it's better to end things honestly rather than modeling dysfunction for your children. Will and I talked about the possibility of meeting in person once I figured out my living situation. He was also planning to leave his marriage, and we both felt like we'd found something special that deserved exploration. Why should we both stay trapped in unsatisfying relationships when we'd found genuine compatibility? I told Paul I wanted a separation so we could both figure out what we actually wanted without the pressure of trying to force something that wasn't working. He could have his practical approach to marriage with someone who wanted that, and I could find someone who valued emotional intimacy the way Will did. Everything fell apart so fast, I'm still trying to process it all. Paul hired some lawyer who apparently specialized in these kinds of cases. And suddenly, I was dealing with divorce papers that painted me like some kind of monster. They documented every conversation I'd had with Will, somehow got access to my credit card statements, made it look like I was this manipulative person who'd been using Paul financially while cheating emotionally. The worst part was finding out about Will. Turns out the man I'd been sharing my deepest feelings with for months wasn't who he claimed to be. Some investigator Paul hired discovered that Will was actually running the same emotional manipulation game with dozens of women online. He'd been collecting our personal information, probably planning to use it for identity theft or blackmail. Can you believe that? Here I was thinking I'd found this deep emotional connection with someone who truly understood me, and he was just another predator taking advantage of lonely wives. The humiliation of having my private conversations with him read aloud in divorce court was unbearable. Paul's lawyer made it sound like I was this gullible woman who'd fallen for an obvious scam. But honestly, how was I supposed to know Will wasn't real? He seemed genuine, asked thoughtful questions, remembered details from our conversations. If Paul had been providing that kind of emotional attention all along, I never would have been vulnerable to someone like Will in the first place. This whole situation just proved how emotionally starved I'd been in my marriage. The judge awarded Paul primary custody of the kids, which was completely unfair. I'd been their primary caretaker for years while he was always working, but suddenly my emotional instability made me unfit to parent. They made it sound like talking to someone online was worse than Paul's years of emotional neglect and workaholism. I lost everything in that divorce: the house, most of our assets, and worst of all, daily access to my children. Paul's transformation into this confident single father was nauseating to watch. Suddenly, he had time for school events and bedtime stories when he'd been too busy working during our entire marriage. Where was that energy when we were together? Within 6 months, Paul was dating some teacher who looked at him like he was this amazing catch. She was probably thrilled to find a man with a stable job and cute kids, not realizing that his work obsession had destroyed his previous marriage. But whatever. Let her deal with being married to someone whose idea of emotional intimacy is discussing the kids' homework schedules. I ended up in a tiny apartment across town, working retail to afford basic living expenses. My family sided with Paul after hearing his version of events, like I was supposed to stay grateful for financial support while receiving zero emotional nourishment. Nobody wanted to hear about the years of loneliness and feeling invisible in my own marriage. The dating scene as a divorced mom with limited custody was brutal. Men either wanted nothing serious or were looking for someone to help raise their kids. I couldn't compete with younger women who didn't have divorce baggage and custody complications. Will's betrayal had destroyed my ability to trust new connections anyway. People in town treated me like a cautionary tale, the ungrateful wife who threw away a good marriage for an online fantasy. They saw Paul with his new girlfriend and 3 well-adjusted kids and assumed I must have been crazy to leave that situation. Nobody cared about the emotional neglect that led to my poor decisions. Even now, 2 years later, I'm barely scraping by financially while Paul bought a bigger house with his teacher girlfriend. My kids talk about weekend trips and family dinners I'm not part of, while I see them every other weekend in my cramped apartment. But everyone acts like this is what I deserved for being unfaithful. I still don't think I was wrong to want emotional connection in my marriage. Paul provided financial security, but never bothered to truly know me as a person. If he'd invested half the energy into our relationship that he put into his jobs, maybe I wouldn't have been so vulnerable to someone like Will. This whole disaster could have been avoided if he'd just made me feel valued and heard from the beginning.